July 14th, 1943, Sicily. The sun had been up for 3 hours, and already the heat was unbearable. The kind of heat that makes your uniform stick to your skin, that turns metal too hot to touch, that makes the air shimmer and dance above the dirt roads like water. Dust hung everywhere, in the air, in your throat, in your eyes. It coated everything with a fine brown powder that tasted like copper and ash. The American advance through Sicily had been brutal from the start. Operation Husky was supposed to be the beginning of the end for the Axis in Europe, a bold thrust into what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Hitler's empire. But there was nothing soft about it. The Germans and Italians were dug in deep, fighting for every farmhouse, every stone wall, every goddamn inch of ground. Snipers hid in bell towers and attics. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Artillery rained down without warning. The men of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, had been fighting non-stop since the landings. House-to-house combat, street fighting, the kind of war where you can't see the enemy until he's right on top of you, where every corner might hide death, where trust evaporates and paranoia becomes survival. They were exhausted, angry, on edge. Some hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. They'd watched friends get cut down by German machine guns. They'd seen medics shot while trying to save the wounded. They'd encountered SS units that fought with a fanaticism that bordered on suicidal, and that showed no mercy to prisoners. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for what they found outside Biscari Airfield that morning. The airfield itself wasn't much to look at. A flat stretch of packed dirt, a few buildings, some damaged aircraft scattered around like broken toys. The Americans had taken it 2 days earlier after fierce fighting. It was supposed to be secure now, a place to rest, regroup, resupply. But just beyond the perimeter, maybe 200 yards from the main buildings, there was a ditch. It wasn't deep, maybe 4 feet at most. Just a depression in the earth, probably cut by rainwater runoff during the winter months. The sides were rough and uneven. Dry grass grew along the edges. In any other context, you wouldn't look at it twice. But this morning, it was full of bodies. Dozens of them. Maybe 50, maybe more. It was hard to count. They were piled on top of each other in some places, spread out in others. German uniforms, field gray wool that looked black in the shadows. Some wore the distinctive camouflage smocks of the Waffen-SS. Black collar tabs with silver runes still visible despite the dust and blood. Their weapons were gone. Rifles, pistols, grenades, all of it had been taken away and stacked in neat piles about 20 yards from the ditch. Helmets, too. Some of the bodies still wore their boots. Others had been stripped of anything valuable. Most of them lay face down, arms twisted beneath them or flung out to the sides. A few were on their backs, mouths open, eyes staring at nothing. Flies were already gathering in the heat, buzzing in thick black clouds. But it was the wounds that told the real story. Bullet holes, all of them, and almost all in the same places. The back of the head, the neck, the upper spine. Entry wounds were small, neat. Exit wounds, where you could see them, were catastrophic. Close-range shots. Execution distance, no more than a few feet. This wasn't combat. There were no shell craters from artillery, no scattered equipment or spent casings littering the ground like you'd see after a firefight. No signs of defensive positions or hasty retreats. No chaos. No confusion. Just method. Cold, calculated method. An American lieutenant stood at the edge of the ditch, staring down at the bodies. His name was Richardson, and he'd been sent to investigate after a chaplain reported something wrong. Richardson had seen plenty of death since landing in Sicily. He'd walked past German bodies on the beaches, in the streets, in burned-out buildings. He'd seen men blown apart by artillery, cut in half by machine gun fire, crushed under tanks. But this was different. This made his stomach turn. Jesus Christ! Someone muttered behind him. Richardson turned. A sergeant stood there, pale despite his tan, looking like he might be sick. Behind him, a small group of soldiers had gathered, drawn by curiosity or duty or some combination of both. They stood in silence, staring at the ditch. Some looked away quickly. Others couldn't stop looking. "Who did this?" Richardson asked, though he already knew the answer. "We did, sir," the sergeant said quietly. "Some of our boys." Richardson felt something cold settle in his chest. When? Yesterday. Day before, maybe. Word is, they were prisoners. SS prisoners. Somebody decided they weren't worth the trouble of guarding. Somebody decided, Richardson repeated. His voice was flat. "Who gave the order?" The sergeant shook his head. "Don't know, sir. Don't know if there was an order. Could have been. People just did it." That was the worst part. Not that it happened, war does terrible things to men, turns them into creatures they don't recognize, but that it might have happened without anyone ordering it. That soldiers might have looked at these prisoners and simply decided, on their own, that killing them was acceptable. Or worse, that they thought they were supposed to. Richardson sent a runner to headquarters immediately. This was beyond his authority. Way beyond. This was something that could blow up in ways he couldn't even imagine. This needed to go up the chain. All the way up. By mid-morning, word had reached the commanding general of the 7th Army, George S. Patton, Jr. When Patton's jeep pulled up to the airfield, soldiers scrambled to attention. That was the effect he had. Even exhausted men straightened their backs and squared their shoulders when Patton appeared. He had that kind of presence, the kind that filled a room or a battlefield just by being there. He stepped out of the jeep slowly, deliberately. Patton never rushed. Even in combat, he moved with a kind of theatrical precision that made everything he did seem important, weighty, significant. He wore his trademark ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, perfectly polished despite the dust and heat. His uniform was immaculate. His helmet sat at just the right angle, tilted forward, aggressive, like he was always about to charge into battle. But his face was stone. An aide approached quickly, saluting. "Sir, the site is just beyond that ridge. Lieutenant Richardson is waiting." Patton didn't respond. He just started walking. The heat hit him like a physical force as he moved away from the jeep. Sweat immediately began soaking through his shirt, but he didn't slow down. He'd fought in Mexico, in France during the Great War, across North Africa in deserts that made Sicily look cool by comparison. Heat didn't bother him. Very little bothered George Patton. But what he saw when he reached the ditch stopped him cold. He stood at the edge for a long moment, perfectly still. His eyes moved slowly across the scene, taking in every detail. The bodies, the wounds, the discarded weapons, the flies. Richardson started to speak, "Sir, we believe." "Be quiet," Patton said softly. Richardson shut his mouth. Patton walked along the edge of the ditch, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He didn't look at the soldiers watching him. He didn't acknowledge the officers standing nearby. His entire focus was on the bodies below. He stopped at one point where 3 corpses lay tangled together. Young men, all of them. Couldn't have been more than 25. One still had his hands raised, frozen in death in a posture of surrender or plea. Another had clearly tried to run. He'd made it maybe 10 feet before being shot in the back. Patton knelt down slowly, his joints popping quietly. He was 57 years old, older than most generals in the field, and sometimes it showed. But right now, age didn't matter. Authority didn't matter. Rank didn't matter. What mattered was what he was looking at. He reached out, almost touching one of the bodies, then stopped. His hand hung in the air for a moment before he pulled it back. There was no point. He could see everything he needed to see. These men had been executed, not killed in battle, not shot while trying to escape. Executed, lined up, disarmed, and murdered. And it had happened under his command. Patton stood slowly, his face still expressionless. But inside, his mind was racing through calculations, implications, consequences. This wasn't just about 50 dead Germans. This was about what kind of army the United States was going to be, what kind of war America was going to fight. The Germans, especially the SS, were monsters. Patton knew that. He'd seen the reports, heard the stories. The SS murdered prisoners routinely. They massacred civilians. They operated without honor, without mercy, without any regard for the laws of war. But that was the whole point, wasn't it? That was what made them different. That was what made America better. If American soldiers started executing prisoners, what separated them from the enemy? If the U.S. Army abandoned the Geneva Convention whenever it was convenient, what were they even fighting for? Patton turned to Richardson. "Who did this?" "We're still piecing it together, sir. It looks like 2 separate incidents, different units, Captain Compton's company and a sergeant named West. Were they following orders?" Richardson hesitated. That hesitation told Patton everything he needed to know. "There are reports, sir, that some of the men believed they were following guidance from higher up, that prisoners were to be handled if they slowed the advance." Patton's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. He knew because he'd been the one giving that guidance. Not explicitly, not in writing, but in briefings, in speeches, in offhand comments that had seemed reasonable at the time. Don't let prisoners slow you down. Speed is everything. Kill the enemy. Don't babysit them. He'd said things like that. Maybe not in those exact words, but close enough. and his officers had heard him. His soldiers had heard him, and they'd interpreted those words in the worst possible way. Patton had always prided himself on aggressive leadership, on inspiring men to fight harder, move faster, hit the enemy with everything they had. But inspiration was a dangerous thing. Words were dangerous things. Once you spoke them, you couldn't control where they went or how they were understood. And now, those words had turned into bullets. He looked back at the ditch one more time. 50 men, maybe more. SS or not, they'd surrendered. They'd laid down their weapons. They'd become prisoners of war, entitled to protection under international law. And American soldiers had murdered them. Behind him, engines idled. More officers had arrived. Word was spreading. Soon, everyone would know. The journalists embedded with the 7th Army would hear about it. Washington would hear about it. The world would hear about it, unless he buried it. Patton could do that. He had the authority. A few orders, a few transfers, a few convenient losses of paperwork. The bodies could disappear. The witnesses could be scattered across different units. The whole thing could vanish into the fog of war. A lot of generals would have done exactly that. Hell, most generals probably would have. The SS were hated. The American public wouldn't mourn them. And keeping the scandal quiet would protect morale, protect careers, protect the momentum of the advance. But George Patton wasn't most generals. He turned to his aide. Get me military police. I want a full investigation. Photographs, witness statements, everything. I want the names of every man involved. And I want charges prepared. The aide blinked. Sir, you heard me? Patton said coldly. This is murder, and I will not command an army of murderers. He walked back to his jeep without another word. As it pulled away, dust rising in its wake, George S. Patton stared straight ahead, his face carved from granite. But inside, he was already at war with himself. Because he absolutely knew that this massacre, this atrocity, this stain on everything he'd built, it was partly his fault, and that knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his life. The jeep disappeared down the road. Behind it, soldiers stood in small groups, talking in low voices. Some looked relieved that the general was taking action. Others looked betrayed. Hadn't Patton told them to be ruthless? Hadn't he demanded aggression? And in the ditch, the bodies lay silent in the Sicilian sun. 50 men who would never see home again. 50 witnesses to the moment when George S. Patton learned the hardest lesson of command. That the greatest threat to an army isn't always the enemy in front of you. Sometimes it's the monster you've created in your own ranks. To understand what happened at Biscari, you have to understand what came before. You have to go back to the beginning of Operation Husky, back to July 10, 1943, when American troops waded ashore onto the beaches of Sicily under a storm of German fire. The invasion was chaos from the first minute. Landing craft grounded on sandbars hundreds of yards from shore, forcing men to jump into chest-deep water while machine guns raked the surf. Some drowned under the weight of their equipment before they even reached the beach. Others made it to sand only to be cut down by artillery that had been pre-ranged to perfection. The Germans knew the Americans were coming. They'd been preparing for weeks. The 45th Infantry Division, along with the 1st Infantry and others, hit the beaches hard and pushed inland fast. But it wasn't like North Africa. This wasn't open desert where you could see the enemy coming from miles away. Sicily was all stone farmhouses and narrow roads, olive groves and rocky hills, perfect defensive terrain. And the Germans defending it weren't regular Wehrmacht conscripts. Many of them were Waffen-SS, Hitler's elite fanatical troops who'd proven themselves on the Eastern Front. They didn't retreat easily. They didn't surrender willingly. And they sure as hell didn't play by the rules. American soldiers quickly learned that combat in Sicily was personal, vicious, and unpredictable. Snipers were everywhere. You'd be walking down a village street one minute, and the next minute half your squad would be dead, shot from some window you'd never even noticed. Machine gun nests were hidden in haystacks, in stone walls, in burned-out buildings that looked abandoned. And the SS had a particular reputation. They were known for fighting to the death, for executing prisoners, for booby-trapping their own dead. Stories circulated about SS soldiers pretending to surrender, hands up, only to pull hidden grenades when Americans got close. True or not, the story spread. And they created an atmosphere of paranoia and rage. By July 13, just 3 days after the landings, the men of the 45th Division were stretched thin. They'd been fighting almost constantly with minimal rest. Casualties were mounting. Supply lines were chaotic. And the heat was relentless, draining men faster than combat did. That's when George S. Patton showed up. Patton had been given command of the 7th Army specifically because of his reputation. He was aggressive, bold, willing to take risks, that made more cautious generals nervous. In North Africa, he'd turned around the Second Corps after the disaster at Kasserine Pass, transforming defeated, demoralized troops into a fighting force that pushed Rommel back across Tunisia. But Patton didn't do it gently. He didn't do anything gently. He truly believed that American soldiers were the finest in the world, but only if they were pushed hard enough, led hard enough, driven to be more aggressive than they thought possible. He gave speeches that were part inspiration, part profanity-laced tirade. He told officers that hesitation killed more men than enemy bullets, that speed and violence of action were worth more than careful planning, that the best way to win was to hit the enemy so hard and so fast that they never had a chance to hit back. "I don't want any messages saying we're holding our position," he famously told his troops before the invasion. "We're advancing constantly and we're not interested in holding anything except the enemy's balls. We're going to hold him by his balls and we're going to kick him in the ass." The men loved it. They cheered. They laughed. They felt invincible. But Patton didn't stop at public speeches. In private briefings with his officers, his language was even more direct. He didn't have time for weakness or sentimentality. He wanted results. And in those briefings, he started talking about prisoners. "Prisoners are a liability," he told a group of battalion commanders on July 12. "They slow you down. They require guards. They require transport. Every minute you spend dealing with prisoners is a minute the enemy uses to regroup." Someone asked the obvious question, "What do we do with them, sir?" Patton's answer, according to multiple witnesses, was blunt. "If they resist, kill them. If they slow the advance, handle it. We're not here to run a goddamn prison camp. We're here to destroy the enemy." To Patton, this was tactical advice, common sense. In war, you had to prioritize. American lives came first. The mission came first. Everything else was secondary. But words are strange things. They take on a life of their own once they leave your mouth. They change as they move down the chain of command, from generals to colonels, to majors, to captains, to lieutenants, to sergeants. By the time they reach the enlisted men, the soldiers doing the actual fighting, they've been filtered through a dozen different interpretations. What Patton meant as "don't let prisoners slow your tactical advance" became "prisoners aren't worth the trouble." What he meant as "prioritize the mission" became "the mission matters more than following the rules." What he meant as "be aggressive" became "anything is acceptable as long as we win." And in the heat and exhaustion and rage of combat, those words became permission. July 14th, 1943. Morning. Just outside Biscari Airfield, Captain John T. Compton stood with his company, looking at the group of prisoners his men had just rounded up. There were maybe 40 of them, Germans and Italians mostly. Some were Wehrmacht, some were SS, identified by the runes on their collars. They looked exhausted, scared. Some were wounded. They'd surrendered without much of a fight. The airfield had already fallen. There was nowhere for them to run, nothing left to defend. They'd laid down their weapons and raised their hands, and Compton's men had gathered them up. Now they stood in a loose group, hands on their heads or behind their necks, surrounded by American riflemen. Compton was tired. He'd barely slept in 4 days. He'd lost good men taking this airfield. Young soldiers who'd never see home again, cut down by German machine guns while trying to cross open ground. He'd seen one of his lieutenants bleed out from a stomach wound, screaming for his mother while medics tried desperately to save him. And now he was supposed to guard these prisoners, assign men to watch them, arrange transport, all while the advance continued and his company got smaller and more exhausted. He thought about what Patton had said, about not letting prisoners slow things down, about handling it. "Sir," his sergeant stood beside him, waiting for orders. Compton looked at the prisoners again. Some of them were SS, the same SS that had been shooting American medics, the same SS that fought like fanatics and showed no mercy. He made a decision. "Set up the machine guns," he said quietly. The sergeant blinked. "Sir, you heard me. Set them up, 50 yards out." "Captain, I don't." "That's an order, Sergeant." The tone in Compton's voice left no room for argument. The sergeant saluted and moved away, his face pale. 10 minutes later, the prisoners were lined up. They knew something was wrong. You could see it in their faces. Some started pleading in broken English. Others prayed. A few just stood there, resigned. The machine guns opened fire. It was over in seconds. The prisoners fell where they stood, cut down by overlapping fields of fire. Some tried to run. None made it more than a few steps. When the shooting stopped, Compton stood there looking at what he'd done. His men stood silent around him, some shocked, some satisfied, some simply numb. "Move out," Compton said. "We have an advance to continue." That same day, different location, a few miles away, Sergeant Horace T. West faced a similar situation. His unit had captured a group of SS prisoners, around 45 men. They'd been part of a rearguard action that had killed 3 Americans before being overrun. West looked at them and felt nothing but rage. These were SS, elite killers, men who'd murdered civilians across Europe, who'd executed Russian prisoners by the thousands, who'd shown no mercy to anyone. And now, they expected mercy? West made his men line the prisoners up along the edge of a ditch. One by one, he walked down the line with his pistol. One by one, he shot them in the back of the head. Some of his men watched. Others turned away. None of them stopped him. When it was done, West holstered his weapon and looked at his squad. "Anyone have a problem with this?" Silence. "Good. Let's move out." Within hours, both incidents were being whispered about across the 45th Division. Soldiers talked. Officers heard. Chaplains reported. And eventually, word reached the top. When investigators asked Compton why he'd ordered the execution, his answer was simple. "I believed I was following General Patton's orders." When they asked West the same question, he said, "We were told not to let prisoners slow us down. I was following orders." They both said the same thing. They both believed they were doing what their commander wanted. And that belief, that interpretation of Patton's aggressive rhetoric, had led to the murder of nearly 50 men. George S. Patton had always believed that words had power, that the right speech could inspire men to do the impossible. But he'd just learned something far more terrible, that words could also inspire men to do the unthinkable. And once those words were out there, once they'd been heard and interpreted and acted upon, there was no taking them back. The bullets had already been fired. The bodies were already in the ditch. And Patton's reputation, everything he'd built, everything he stood for, was about to be tested in a way he'd never imagined. George S. Patton sat alone in his command tent, reading reports by the light of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the sounds of war continued. Distant artillery, trucks moving supplies, men shouting orders. But inside the tent, there was only silence and the rustle of paper. The reports in front of him were devastating. Military police had worked fast. Within 24 hours of Patton's order to investigate, they'd compiled witness statements, taken photographs, and identified the principal figures involved. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. 2 separate massacres, 2 different units, nearly 80 prisoners murdered in cold blood. Captain John T. Compton, Sergeant Horace T. West. Both had admitted to killing prisoners. Neither showed remorse, and both claimed they'd been following the spirit of orders that came from the top, from Patton himself. He set the reports down and rubbed his face with both hands. He was exhausted, not from combat, but from the weight of what he was facing. This wasn't just a tactical problem that could be solved with aggressive maneuver. This wasn't an enemy that could be defeated with superior firepower. This was a moral crisis, a test of character. And the whole world was watching. Patton knew what most generals would do in his position. They'd bury it, quietly transfer the men involved, spread the witnesses across different units, let the whole thing disappear into the chaos of war. It happened all the time. Uncomfortable truths swept under the rug, because dealing with them was harder than ignoring them. Hell, Patton had done it himself on smaller matters. Everyone had. That's how armies worked. But this was different. 80 men, executed, murdered. And if he covered it up, if he protected Compton and West and everyone else involved, what would that say? That American soldiers could commit war crimes with impunity as long as they were killing the right people? That the rules of war only applied when it was convenient? Patton stood and paced the tent. His boots made soft sounds on the canvas floor. Outside, someone laughed at a joke. Life went on. The war went on. Men fought and died, and the world kept turning. But in this tent, in this moment, George S. Patton had to make a decision that would define everything that came after. He thought about his father, also George Patton, a man who'd instilled in him from childhood the values of honor and duty. He thought about his years at West Point, where they drilled into every cadet that officers were held to a higher standard. That with authority came responsibility. That leadership meant taking the hard path, not the easy one. He thought about what America was supposed to represent, why they were fighting this war in the first place. And he made his choice. July 16, 1943. The announcement went out through official channels. Captain John T. Compton and Sergeant Horace T. West were to be arrested and charged with murder under military law. Courts-martial would be convened. Evidence would be presented. Justice would be served. The reaction across the 7th Army was immediate and explosive. Officers were stunned. Enlisted men were confused. Some felt betrayed. Hadn't Patton told them to be ruthless? Hadn't he demanded aggression? Hadn't he made it clear that prisoners were a liability? Others felt relief. They'd been disturbed by what happened at Biscari, troubled by the casual brutality they'd witnessed. They wanted to believe the American Army was better than that. But mostly, people were scared. Because if Compton and West could be charged, who else might be next? How many other soldiers had done things in the heat of battle that could be called into question? Where was the line between combat and murder? And who got to decide? The whispers started immediately. In mess tents and foxholes, men talked in low voices about what this meant. Some defended Compton and West, saying they were scapegoats, that Patton was covering his own ass by sacrificing them. Others said the charges were justified, that there had to be limits even in war. And everyone wondered what would happen next. The investigation expanded rapidly. Military police interviewed dozens of witnesses. They photographed the ditches where the bodies had been found. They collected shell casings, examined wounds, documented every detail. What emerged was a picture of two separate but similar incidents, both driven by a toxic combination of exhaustion, rage, and misunderstood orders. In Compton's case, witnesses described how he'd ordered machine guns set up to execute the prisoners, how some of his men had questioned the order but followed it anyway, how the shooting had lasted only seconds but had felt like an eternity, how afterward Compton had simply ordered everyone to move out, as if nothing unusual had happened. In West's case, the testimony was even more chilling. Multiple soldiers described watching West walk down the line of prisoners, shooting each one individually, methodically, without emotion. Some prisoners had begged for mercy. Others had tried to run. West had shot them all. But the most damaging testimony came when investigators started asking why. "We thought we were following orders," one soldier said. "General Patton said not to let prisoners slow us down," said another. "We heard that prisoners were expendable if they got in the way of the mission. Everyone knew the SS didn't take prisoners. Why should we?" The words piled up, statement after statement, all pointing back to the same source. Patton's aggressive rhetoric had created an environment where murder seemed acceptable, where soldiers believed they had permission, even encouragement, to execute prisoners rather than guard them. Patton read every statement personally. Each one felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He'd never ordered the executions. He'd never said kill prisoners. He'd certainly never intended for his words to be interpreted as permission for war crimes. But that didn't matter, did it? He was the commanding general. His words carried weight. His speeches set the tone. His philosophy shaped how thousands of men thought about combat, about the enemy, about what was acceptable. If his words had led to murder, even indirectly, even unintentionally, then he bore responsibility, and that knowledge was destroying him from the inside. July 25th, 1943. Palermo. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, arrived in Sicily to personally assess the situation. He'd been briefed on Biscari, and he was furious. The meeting with Patton was brief and brutal. "George," Eisenhower said, his usually friendly face hard as stone, "what the hell happened?" Patton stood at attention, his uniform perfect despite the heat. "A breakdown in discipline, sir. 2 separate incidents involving the execution of prisoners. I've ordered full investigations and courts-martial." "I know what you've ordered," Eisenhower snapped. "What I want to know is how it happened in the first place. How does an American Army unit, 2 units, decide that murdering prisoners is acceptable? The men involved claimed they were following orders, sir. Were they?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Patton wanted to say no. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd never ordered executions, that his words had been misinterpreted, but he couldn't, because the truth was more complicated than that. "Not explicitly, sir," Patton said slowly, "but I may have. My rhetoric may have created an environment where they believed such actions were acceptable." Eisenhower's jaw tightened. "You may have?" "I was emphatic about not letting prisoners slow the advance, about being aggressive, about putting the mission first. My words were open to interpretation, and now 80 men are dead because of that interpretation." Patton said nothing. There was nothing to say. Eisenhower paced the room, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, Sicily was being secured. The invasion was succeeding. The Germans were being pushed back. Everything was going according to plan, except for this. "George," Eisenhower said finally, "you know I value you. You're one of the finest combat commanders we have. But this He gestured at the reports on the desk. This is unacceptable. If this becomes public, it'll be a disaster. The press will crucify us. Congress will demand answers. The president himself might get involved. I understand, sir. Do you? Because right now, your career, hell, the entire Sicily campaign, hangs by a thread. If we can't show that we took this seriously, that we held people accountable, then everything we've accomplished means nothing. Patton met Eisenhower's eyes. The courts-martial will proceed, sir. Full transparency. Let the evidence speak for itself. And if that evidence implicates you, if Compton and West testify that they were following your guidance, then I'll face the consequences. Eisenhower studied him for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. See that you do. Because, George, I'm telling you right now, one more scandal, one more incident, one more reason for anyone to question your judgment, and you're done. Understand? Yes, sir. Good. Dismissed. Patton saluted and left. As he walked back to his own headquarters, the weight of Eisenhower's words settled over him like a physical burden. One more scandal. That's all it would take. And Patton knew, absolutely knew, that the courts-martial about to begin would determine not just the fate of Compton and West, but his own future as well. September 2nd, 1943. First court-martial. Sergeant Horace T. West stood before a military tribunal in a converted schoolhouse in Sicily. The room was hot, crowded with officers and witnesses. Outside, the war continued. Inside, justice, or something like it, was being attempted. The prosecution laid out the case, methodically. Witness after witness testified about what they'd seen. The line of prisoners. West walking down the line with his pistol. The shots. The bodies falling. The evidence was overwhelming. West didn't deny any of it. His defense attorney tried a different approach. Justification. Sergeant West was following orders, the defense argued. Orders that came from the highest levels of command. General Patton himself had made it clear that prisoners were not to slow the advance. That speed and aggression were paramount, that the mission came first. Witnesses were called who testified about Patton's speeches, about briefings where officers were told not to let prisoners become a liability, about the general atmosphere of aggression that permeated the 7th Army. But the prosecution countered hard. There is no order, no speech, no briefing, no guidance that explicitly authorizes the execution of surrendered prisoners. The Geneva Convention is clear. Prisoners of war are to be treated humanely. Period. Sergeant West knew this. He violated it anyway. And now he must face the consequences. The tribunal deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict: guilty of murder. Sentence: life imprisonment. The courtroom erupted. Some officers applauded. Justice had been served. Others looked sick. One of their own had been convicted for doing what he thought was right. West himself showed no emotion. He stood at attention, accepted the verdict, and was led away. But his sentence would later be commuted. He'd served less than a year before being released. Whether that was mercy or political expedience, no one could say. September 23, 1943. Second court-martial. Captain John T. Compton's trial followed a similar pattern, but with a crucial difference. Compton was an officer. He'd graduated from West Point. He'd been trained in military law, in the rules of war, in the Geneva Convention. He couldn't claim ignorance the way an enlisted man might, but his defense was more sophisticated. Captain Compton reasonably believed he was following lawful orders, his attorney argued. General Patton's guidance about prisoners was clear and consistent. The captain interpreted those orders in good faith. In the heat of combat, under extreme stress, he made a decision he believed was tactically necessary and legally authorized. The defense called witnesses who testified about the chaotic conditions in Sicily, about SS units that had murdered American prisoners, about booby traps and false surrenders, about the genuine danger that prisoners posed in a fluid combat situation. And they quoted Patton extensively. Transcripts of speeches, notes from briefings, second-hand accounts of conversations where Patton had allegedly said prisoners were a liability, that speed was everything, that the mission couldn't be compromised. The prosecution fought back. Captain Compton ordered the systematic execution of 40 prisoners, men who had surrendered, men who were disarmed, men who posed no threat. There is no order from General Patton or anyone else that justifies murder. But the defense had planted doubt. If Compton genuinely believed he was following orders, if Patton's rhetoric had been ambiguous enough to allow such an interpretation, then could he be held fully responsible? The tribunal deliberated for 2 days. The verdict: not guilty. The acquittal sent shockwaves through the Army. It suggested that Patton's words, his aggressive, uncompromising rhetoric, had been so influential, so pervasive that an officer could reasonably believe that murdering prisoners was acceptable. It was a devastating indictment. Not of Compton, of Patton himself. When Patton heard the verdict, he was in his quarters, alone. He read the report 3 times, each reading making him angrier. Not at Compton, not at the tribunal, at himself. An officer had been acquitted of murder because the court believed Patton's rhetoric had given him justification. That was the message. That was what history would remember. That George S. Patton's words had been so reckless, so poorly chosen, that they'd led directly to atrocity. He sat at his desk and opened his personal diary. For a long time he just stared at the blank page. Then he began to write. Today, Captain Compton was acquitted. The court found that he reasonably believed he was following my guidance. My guidance. My words led to the deaths of 40 men. This is murder, and I am partly responsible. The pen shook slightly as he wrote. I have spent my career trying to make American soldiers more aggressive, more willing to close with and destroy the enemy, but I have failed to make clear that there are lines that cannot be crossed. That victory without honor is no victory at all. That we must fight harder than the enemy, but cleaner. Always cleaner. He paused, then added, I am 57 years old, and I have just learned a lesson that should have been obvious from the beginning. Words matter. Commands matter. The tone you set as a leader ripples through everything your men do. And if that tone is unclear, if it allows for interpretation, if it gives permission, even unintentionally, for brutality, then you have failed. He closed the diary and sat in silence. Outside, the war continued. Men fought and died. Armies advanced and retreated. History unfolded. But in this room, George S. Patton confronted the hardest truth of leadership, that you are responsible not just for what you order, but for what your words inspire. Not just for what you intend, but for what others understand. Not just for victories won, but for how they're won. And that night, alone in his quarters in Sicily, Patton understood that Biscari would follow him for the rest of his life. A reminder, a warning, a scar that would never fully heal. October 1943, somewhere in Sicily. George S. Patton sat at a small wooden desk in his command tent, illuminated by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the Mediterranean night was unusually quiet. No artillery, no aircraft engines, just the distant murmur of soldiers settling in for the evening. The Sicily campaign was winding down. The Americans and British had secured the island. Mussolini had fallen. Italy was teetering. By any measure, it had been a success. But Patton felt no satisfaction. In front of him lay his personal diary, a leather-bound volume he'd kept for years. He wrote in it almost every night, sometimes just a few lines, sometimes pages. It was where he processed the chaos of command, where he vented frustrations he couldn't express publicly, where he recorded his private thoughts about war, leadership, and the weight of responsibility. Tonight, the pages would receive some of his most honest and most painful reflections. He picked up his pen, hesitated, then began to write. October 8, 1943. The courts-martial are over. West convicted. Compton acquitted. The verdicts satisfy no one. West believes he was following orders and will spend his life in prison for it, though I suspect Washington will commute the sentence eventually. Politics always finds a way. Compton walks free, vindicated by a court that essentially ruled my rhetoric was so aggressive that he reasonably believed he could execute prisoners. Reasonably believed. Those words haunt me. I have spent weeks trying to understand how we arrived at this point. How American soldiers, trained, disciplined, led by officers who graduated from West Point, could line up prisoners and shoot them like dogs. How men who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution could commit murder and claim they were following my orders. The easy answer is to blame Compton and West. To say they were weak, undisciplined, cruel, that they failed to uphold the values we claim to fight for. But that answer is too easy, and it's not the truth. The truth is harder, more uncomfortable, more personal. I created the conditions that made Biscari possible. Patton paused, staring at what he'd written. Admitting it, even here, in his private diary, felt like tearing something open inside himself. But he continued, not through direct orders. I never said execute prisoners. I never authorized murder. But through rhetoric, through speeches that emphasized aggression over discipline, through guidance that prioritized speed over adherence to law, through an atmosphere that made soldiers believe anything was acceptable as long as it helped us win. Don't let prisoners slow you down. I said that multiple times to officers who then passed it down to their men. And somewhere in that transmission, the message mutated. What I meant as tactical guidance became moral permission. I believed I was inspiring men, making them fierce, giving them the killer instinct necessary to defeat a brutal brutal enemy. Instead, I gave them justification for atrocity. The SS are monsters. I believe that, absolutely. They've committed crimes across Europe that defy comprehension. They murder civilians, execute prisoners, operate without honor or mercy. They deserve no sympathy. But that's exactly why we must be different. If we become like them, if we abandon the laws of war whenever it's convenient, then what are we fighting for? What separates us from the enemy except geography? Victory without honor is no victory at all. I understand that now. I wish I'd understood it sooner. Patton set down his pen and rubbed his eyes. He was tired, not physically, but spiritually. The kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. He thought about his father, George S. Patton Sr., a man who'd raised him on stories of military honor and duty. His father had fought in wars, yes, but always with a code. Always with the understanding that some things were more important than winning. Patton remembered a conversation from his childhood, maybe when he was 10 or 11. His father had been telling him about the Civil War, about men who'd fought with incredible courage on both sides. War brings out the best and worst in men, his father had said. The best rise to heroism, the worst descend to savagery. A leader's job is to elevate the best and suppress the worst. To remind men that they're soldiers, not animals. At the time, young George hadn't fully understood. Now, 4 decades later, and halfway around the world, the words echoed with devastating clarity. He picked up the pen again. I have spent my career trying to be the toughest, most aggressive commander in the American Army. I wanted my men to fear me more than they feared the enemy. I wanted them to believe that hesitation was worse than death, that speed and violence of action could overcome any obstacle. And I still believe that, to a point. But I failed to balance aggression with discipline. I failed to make clear that there are lines that cannot be crossed, no matter how convenient it might be to cross them. I failed to emphasize that American soldiers must fight harder than the enemy, but cleaner, always cleaner. Eisenhower warned me. After he learned about Biscari, he told me that one more scandal would end my career. One more incident that called my judgment into question. He was right to warn me. But the real damage isn't to my career. It's to the men who served under me. The men who believed they were doing what I wanted when they murdered those prisoners. The men who now carry that weight for the rest of their lives. And it's to the Army itself. To the idea that America stands for something better. That we're not just another empire conquering territory, but a nation defending principles. Biscari threatens that idea. It suggests that maybe we're not so different from the enemy after all. That maybe the high-minded rhetoric about freedom and justice is just propaganda, and underneath we're just as brutal as anyone else. I refuse to accept that. Patton stood and paced the small tent. His boots made soft sounds on the canvas floor. He could hear men outside, talking in low voices. Somewhere, someone laughed. Life went on. The war went on. But something had changed. In him, in how he understood leadership. He returned to the desk and continued writing. Going forward, I will be more careful with my words, more precise, more aware of how they might be interpreted by men under stress, by officers trying to please their commander, by soldiers looking for any excuse to act on their worst impulses. I will remind my staff, constantly, repeatedly, until they're sick of hearing it, that the Geneva Convention is not negotiable, that prisoners are to be treated humanely, that violations will be punished, that winning the wrong way is the same as losing. This is not weakness. This is not softness. This is discipline. True discipline is what separates soldiers from killers, armies from mobs, civilization from barbarism. The Germans, especially the SS, have abandoned discipline. They fight like animals. They murder like animals. And they will lose like animals. We will win because we're better. Not just better equipped or better trained, but better in every sense that matters. We'll win because we fight for something worth defending, something higher than ourselves, but only if we actually live up to those principles. Only if we hold ourselves accountable when we fail. Only if we're willing to admit, even in private, even in the pages of a diary no one else will read, that we made mistakes. Biscari was a mistake. My mistake. And I will spend the rest of this war, the rest of my life, trying to ensure it never happens again. Patton closed the diary and sat in silence. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Outside, the world continued its chaotic spin toward whatever future awaited. But in this moment, George S. Patton had done something few generals ever do. He'd looked honestly at his own failure. He'd admitted, to himself at least, that he'd been wrong. And he'd committed to being better. Not for his career, not for his reputation, but because it was right. Because some things mattered more than victory. Some things mattered more than glory, and one of those things was ensuring that the men who served under him understood what they were fighting for, not just against Nazi Germany, but for the idea that even in war, especially in war, there are lines that cannot be crossed. Patton stood, extinguished the lamp, and stepped out into the Sicilian night. Tomorrow, the war would continue. There would be more battles, more decisions, more chances to succeed or fail. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, he'd learned something that would change him forever. That the greatest enemy isn't always the one carrying a rifle. Sometimes, it's the voice inside your own head. The one that says winning is all that matters. The one that says the ends justify the means. The one that says rules are for weaker men. George S. Patton had listened to that voice his entire career. And at Biscari, that voice had led to murder. He would never listen to it again. November 1943 to May 1945. The war rolled on, indifferent to scandal. From Sicily, the Allies moved to the Italian mainland. Then came the planning for Normandy, the liberation of France, the race across Europe, the final push into Germany itself. And through it all, George S. Patton remained one of the most feared and respected commanders in the American Army. But he was different after Biscari. Not visibly. To the outside world, to the press, to his superiors, to the men in his command, he was still the same aggressive, profane, larger-than-life figure. He still wore his ivory-handled revolvers, still gave fiery speeches, still drove his men harder than any other general in the theater. But those who worked closely with him noticed changes. He was more careful with his words, more precise in his orders, more explicit about the rules of engagement and the treatment of prisoners. Briefings that once consisted of passionate exhortations to kill every last one of the bastards now included detailed reminders about the Geneva Convention, about the importance of taking prisoners for intelligence purposes, about the requirement, not suggestion, requirement, to treat surrendered enemy soldiers humanely. Some officers found it tedious. "We get it, sir," one colonel reportedly said. "We know the rules." Patton's response was, "Ice cold, apparently you don't. Because if you did, Biscari wouldn't have happened. So we're going to go over the rules again, and again, and again, until they're so deeply ingrained that no one in this command could possibly misunderstand them. Clear? Clear, sir." The word about Biscari had spread through the army, despite attempts to keep it quiet. Most soldiers didn't know the details, but they knew something had happened. Something bad enough that it had nearly ended Patton's career. And they knew that Patton had changed because of it. April 12, 1945. Ohrdruf concentration camp, Germany. When Patton's Third Army liberated Ohrdruf, one of the first concentration camps the Americans encountered, the general insisted on touring it personally. What he saw there almost broke him. The bodies, the gas chambers, the ovens, the survivors who looked more like skeletons than human beings, the evidence of systematic industrial-scale murder that defied comprehension. Patton, who'd seen death on 3 continents, who'd walked through battlefields covered in corpses, who'd witnessed the worst that war could produce, vomited. He forced himself to keep walking, to see it all, to witness what the Nazi regime had done. And afterward, he did something that directly connected back to Biscari. He ordered the German citizens from the nearby town to tour the camp. All of them. Men, women, children over the age of 12. He wanted them to see, to know, to understand what had been done in their name. And he had it all documented. Photographers from the Signal Corps took thousands of pictures. Journalists wrote detailed accounts. Film crews captured everything. People will try to deny this, Patton said to his staff. 20 years from now, 50 years from now, there will be people who claim this never happened, that it's exaggerated, that we're making it up for propaganda. He pointed to the cameras. So we document everything, every body, every gas chamber, every piece of evidence. We make it impossible to deny. One of his aides, a young captain who'd been with Patton since Sicily, watched him carefully. The general looked older suddenly, tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Sir," the captain said quietly, "why is this so important to you?" Patton was silent for a long moment, staring at the camp. Finally, he spoke. "Because there's a difference between us and them, between the Allies and the Nazis. We fight to stop this, to end it, to make sure it never happens again." He turned to face the captain. "But that difference only matters if we actually uphold it, if we're willing to hold ourselves accountable when we fail, if we prove, through our actions, not just our words, that we're better." The captain understood. He'd heard the stories about Biscari, about the courts-martial, about how Patton had insisted on prosecuting his own men rather than covering up war crimes. "That's what you did in Sicily," the captain said. "You held us accountable." Patton nodded slowly. "And I'll keep doing it." for the rest of this war and whatever comes after. Because if we become like them, if we commit atrocities and then justify them or hide them, then what the hell are we fighting for? He looked back at the camp one more time. We're better than this. We have to be, and we prove it by our conduct, not our rhetoric. May 8th, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe ends. When news came that Germany had surrendered, celebrations erupted across the Allied forces. Men who'd fought for years finally allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive, that they might go home. Patton celebrated with his men, but his diary entry that night was subdued. The war in Europe is over. We've won. The Third Reich is destroyed, Hitler is dead, and millions have been liberated from Nazi tyranny. It should feel triumphant. And in many ways, it does. But I keep thinking about what we found in the camps, about the millions who weren't liberated in time, about the evil that human beings are capable of when they abandon all moral restraint. And I think about Biscari, not because the two are comparable. They're not. What we did at Biscari was terrible, but it was nothing compared to the systematic genocide the Nazis committed. But because both spring from the same source, the belief that some people are less than human, that rules don't apply to them, that anything done to them is justified. The Nazis believed Jews, Slavs, Romani, and others were subhuman, so they murdered them by the millions. At Biscari, some of my soldiers believed the SS were animals who deserved no mercy, so they executed them. The scale is incomparable, but the underlying principle is the same. The moment you decide that someone is outside the protection of law, outside the bounds of human dignity, you've started down a path that leads to atrocity. I learned that lesson in Sicily. I wish I'd learned it sooner. I wish I'd made it clearer to my men from the beginning. But I can't change the past. I can only try to ensure that in the future, whatever role I play in it, I never forget what happens when discipline fails, when rhetoric outpaces morality, when winning becomes more important than how you win. August 1945 to December 1945. After VE Day, Patton was assigned to military government duties in Bavaria. It was a politically complicated role, dealing with defeated Germans, managing displaced persons, beginning the process of rebuilding. Patton hated it. He was a warrior, not an administrator. He wanted to fight the next war, against the Soviets if necessary, not deal with paperwork and politics. But even in these final months, the lessons of Biscari stayed with him. When reports came of American soldiers mistreating German prisoners or civilians, Patton came down hard. Commanders who'd once known him as the general who demanded blood and speed now saw a different side. He insisted on proper treatment of prisoners. He demanded accountability for misconduct. He enforced the rules. Some thought he'd gone soft. Others understood that he'd simply grown wiser. One incident stood out. A group of American soldiers had beaten several German POWs in retaliation for atrocities the prisoners had allegedly committed. When it was reported to Patton, he personally went to the detention facility. He looked at the beaten Germans. Then, he looked at the Americans who'd done it. "You think you're heroes," he said quietly. "You think you're delivering justice. You're not. You're proving that we're no better than the enemy we just defeated." He pointed to the prisoners. "These men may be guilty of war crimes. If they are, they'll be tried. Evidence will be presented. Justice will be served. But it will be done according to law, not mob violence. To the Americans, you're relieved of duty pending court-martial. Get out of my sight." The soldiers were shocked. "Sir, they're Nazis. I don't care if they're Hitler himself," Patton snapped. "We have rules, and you'll follow them, or you'll face the consequences. Now get out." The incident barely made it into official records, but word spread among the troops Patton had changed. The general, who'd once seemed to encourage aggression at any cost, now drew hard lines, now demanded discipline above all else. Because he'd learned, the hard way, what happened when you didn't. December 9th, 1945. George S. Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died 12 days later, on December 21st, at the age of 60. Among his personal effects was his diary. His family eventually published excerpts, though many passages remained private for decades. The entries about Biscari, the self-recrimination, the acknowledgement of responsibility, the commitment to change, weren't widely known until years after his death. But those who read them understood something important, that George S. Patton, the hard-charging, profane, aggressive commander who'd led armies across continents, had been capable of introspection, of growth, of admitting admitting mistakes, that he'd learned from Biscari, and that the lesson had stayed with him until the day he died. The shadow of Biscari never left George S. Patton. But he didn't run from it. He faced it, confronted it, let it change him. And in doing so, he became more than just a great tactician or a brilliant commander. He became a leader who understood that true strength isn't about never failing. It's about what you do after you fail, how you learn, how you grow, how you ensure that the mistakes of yesterday don't become the atrocities of tomorrow. Biscari was Patton's greatest failure, but how he responded to it, with honesty, accountability, and determination to be better, was one of his finest moments. The war ended, the bodies were buried, the trials were forgotten, but the lesson remained, and George S. Patton carried it to his grave. For decades, the Biscari Massacre barely existed in public consciousness. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't mentioned in most histories of World War II. When people thought about Sicily, if they thought about it at all, they remembered the successful invasion, the liberation of the island, the beginning of the end for Mussolini, not the ditch full of bodies, not the courts-martial, not the moment when American soldiers crossed a line that should never be crossed. There were reasons for this silence. First, the immediate priorities. In 1943, the Allies were still fighting for survival. The war's outcome was far from certain. Publicizing American war crimes, even relatively small-scale ones, would have handed the enemy a propaganda victory. It would have damaged morale. It would have raised uncomfortable questions about whether the Allies were really any better than the Axis. So Biscari was classified, buried in military archives, mentioned only in hushed conversations among those who'd been there. Second, the narrative that emerged after the war. World War II became the good war, the clear moral conflict where democracy defeated fascism, where heroes stormed beaches and liberated concentration camps, where America proved its greatness. That narrative had no room for moral complexity, no space for American atrocities, however small compared to Nazi genocide. So Biscari stayed buried. Third, the Cold War. Almost immediately after defeating the Nazis, America found itself in conflict with the Soviet Union. The need to present a unified, morally superior front against communism made dredging up old war crimes seem counterproductive. Better to focus on Soviet atrocities, of which there were many, than to examine American failings. So Biscari remained forgotten. But history has a way of resurfacing. Truth has a way of demanding acknowledgement. The 1970s, the Vietnam War, had shattered America's self-image as the world's moral guardian. My Lai, where American soldiers massacred hundreds of Vietnamese civilians, had proven that U.S. forces were capable of atrocities just like anyone else. The Pentagon Papers revealed systematic lying by the government about the war's conduct. In this atmosphere of disillusionment and questioning, historians began re-examining World War II with more critical eyes, not to diminish the Allied victory or equate American conduct with Nazi genocide, but to understand the war more honestly, more completely. And that's when Biscari started receiving serious scholarly attention. Researchers dug through declassified military records. They interviewed aging veterans who'd been there. They pieced together what had happened in Sicily and asked uncomfortable questions about command responsibility, military justice, and the mythology of the good war. The findings were sobering. Yes, Biscari was a war crime. Yes, American soldiers had executed prisoners in violation of the Geneva Convention. Yes, Patton's rhetoric had contributed to creating an environment where such actions seemed acceptable. But also, yes, Patton had insisted on investigations and courts-martial. Yes, consequences had been imposed. Yes, the American military system, however imperfectly, had held itself accountable. That last point was crucial, because when historians compared Biscari to other World War II atrocities, a pattern emerged. The Germans committed war crimes constantly, systematically, as a matter of policy. The Waffen-SS murdered prisoners routinely. The Wehrmacht participated in genocide across Eastern Europe. And when called to account after the war, German officers claimed they were just following orders and showed little remorse. The Soviets committed atrocities on a massive scale. Mass executions, systematic rape, collective punishment. And they never acknowledged them, never prosecuted anyone, never admitted wrongdoing. Even the British had incidents, though fewer and smaller in scale, that were quietly swept under the rug. But the Americans, however imperfectly, had tried to hold themselves accountable. Not every time, not consistently, but more often than any other major combatant. Biscari stood out precisely because it was investigated and prosecuted, because it created a record, because the military justice system, however flawed, actually functioned. That didn't excuse what happened, didn't make it acceptable, didn't erase the 80 dead prisoners or the failure of command that led to their deaths. But it mattered, because it suggested that even in the chaos and brutality of war, even when the enemy was genuinely monstrous, even when victory seemed to justify any means, some armies tried to maintain standards. Some commanders insisted on accountability. Some nations attempted, however imperfectly, to fight according to rules that recognized human dignity. The 2000s, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan brought renewed attention to how democratic societies conduct warfare. Abu Ghraib, Haditha, Guantanamo, the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, the killing of civilians in drone strikes. Once again, America faced questions about whether its conduct lived up to its principles, whether the war on terror justified abandoning constraints, whether fighting a brutal enemy meant becoming brutal yourself. And once again, historians looked back to World War II, not for simple answers, but for lessons. Biscari became part of that conversation. Military colleges taught it as a case study in command responsibility. Ethics courses used it to discuss the importance of clear guidance and the dangers of ambiguous rhetoric. JAG officers studied the courts-martial to understand how military justice could and should handle war crimes committed by U.S. personnel. The verdict on Patton himself evolved. Early histories portrayed him as either a heroic warrior or a dangerous cowboy, depending on the author's perspective. But more nuanced assessments recognized him as a complex figure, brilliant tactician, aggressive commander, but also someone capable of learning from mistakes. Someone who, when confronted with the consequences of his rhetoric, took responsibility and changed. That last part, the willingness to change, became increasingly important as scholars studied leadership in wartime. Because many commanders, when faced with evidence of atrocities under their command, respond with denial. They cover up. They blame subordinates. They protect themselves. Patton had ordered investigations. He'd allowed courts-martial. He'd admitted, at least in his private diary, that he bore responsibility. That didn't make him a saint. He remained a deeply flawed human being. Vain, profane, sometimes cruel to his own men, politically tone-deaf. But it made him a leader, willing to learn, willing to accept that aggression without discipline leads to atrocity, willing to hold himself to standards even when it damaged his reputation. And in a war full of moral compromises, that willingness mattered. Today, the Biscari Massacre is no longer buried. It appears in histories of World War II, in documentaries, in academic journals. The National Archives has declassified the relevant documents. The court-martial transcripts are publicly available. We know what happened. We know why. We know how Patton responded. And we can ask, what does Biscari teach us? First, that rhetoric matters. Words spoken by leaders don't just inspire, they authorize, they justify, they provide permission. Commanders must be precise, careful, aware that ambiguous guidance will be interpreted in the worst possible ways by exhausted, frightened, angry soldiers. Second, that even just wars require discipline. The Allies were right to fight Nazi Germany. The cause was moral, necessary, unambiguous. But rightness of cause doesn't eliminate moral constraints on conduct. If anything, it increases them, because fighting for civilization means actually upholding civilized standards. Third, that accountability distinguishes armies from mobs. Violations will happen. War is chaotic, brutal, dehumanizing. But how an institution responds to violations, whether with cover-ups or investigations, denial or accountability, determines its character. Fourth, that leadership requires honesty, especially self-honesty. The willingness to look at your own failures, admit your role in disaster, and change your behavior. Patton did that. Not publicly, he couldn't afford to, given the political realities, but privately, where it mattered most. Fifth, that the line between soldier and killer is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Training, discipline, leadership, and clear rules are what maintain that line. Remove them, and even good men can become monsters. The ditch outside Biscari Airfield is still there, unmarked, unremembered. Just another piece of Sicilian soil, baked by the sun, eroded by time. No monument marks what happened. No plaque explains the story. The men who died there, German and SS, young and far from home, are forgotten by history. But the lesson remains. War brings out the best and worst in humanity, sometimes simultaneously, in the same people, on the same day. The challenge, the eternal challenge, is to elevate the best and suppress the worst, to fight with courage but also restraint, to defeat the enemy while maintaining your own humanity. George S. Patton learned that lesson in Sicily. It cost 80 lives. It nearly cost him his career, but he learned it, and in learning it, he gave future commanders a template: admit mistakes, take responsibility, enforce standards, never let victory become more important than honor. The history books remember Patton as a great general. The popular imagination remembers him as a warrior, but those who study Biscari remember him as something more complex: a leader who failed and then grew, who made terrible mistakes and then worked to correct them, who realized too late that his words had consequences and then chose better words. That's the real legacy of Biscari. Not that atrocities never happened, but that when they did, someone cared enough to investigate, to prosecute, to hold people accountable, even when it was hard, even when it was politically dangerous, even when it damaged the reputation of one of America's most famous generals. That accountability, however imperfect, however incomplete, is what separated the Allies from their enemies, then and now. There's a photograph that doesn't exist. If you search for images of the Biscari Massacre, you'll find very little. A few grainy shots of the ditch where bodies were found, maybe some documentation from the courts-martial, but no iconic image that captures the horror of what happened. No single photograph that distills the moment into something undeniable. That's deliberate. In 1943, the U.S. military controlled what images reached the public. Photographers were embedded with combat units, but operated under censorship. Images that damaged morale, revealed tactical information, or undermined public support for the war never made it past military review. Pictures of American soldiers executing prisoners definitely fell into that category. So if photographs were taken, and they probably were, as part of the investigation, they remained buried in classified archives, hidden from history, protected from public view. But the absence of photographs doesn't mean the absence of truth. Biscari happened. 80 men died. American soldiers committed murder, and George S. Patton had to decide what to do about it. This is the final lesson, the one that ties everything together, the one that explains why Biscari still matters 80 years later. War strips everything away. It strips away pretense, comfort, safety, the social conventions that normally govern human behavior. In combat, you discover who you really are beneath the layers of civilization. Some people discover courage. Others discover cowardice. Some find compassion even in horror. Others find only darkness. War reveals. And what it revealed at Biscari was something uncomfortable, that American soldiers, like all soldiers, are capable of atrocity. That exhaustion, fear, anger, and poor leadership can combine to create monsters. That the difference between a soldier and a murderer isn't some intrinsic moral superiority, it's discipline, training, leadership, and clear rules. Remove those constraints, and anyone can cross the line. The SS, who murdered millions in concentration camps, were human beings. So were the Wehrmacht soldiers who participated in genocide across Eastern Europe. So were the Soviet troops who raped and murdered their way across Germany. So were the Japanese soldiers who committed the rape of Nanking. They weren't demons. They were people. People who'd been put in situations where all constraints had been removed, where leadership encouraged brutality, where victims were dehumanized, where violence became normalized, and people, given those conditions, are capable of anything. The Americans at Biscari proved that Allied soldiers weren't inherently different. Put them in the right conditions, exhausted, angry, poorly guided, fighting an enemy they'd been taught to hate, and they could commit war crimes too. That's the uncomfortable truth. But here's the other truth, the one that matters just as much. What happened after? In Nazi Germany, war crimes were policy. When SS Einsatzgruppen murdered Jews, Romani, and others, they weren't violating orders. They were following them. When Wehrmacht units participated in the Holocaust, their commanders approved. When German soldiers executed prisoners, it was because that's what they'd been authorized to do. And after the war, when called to account, German officers claimed they'd had no choice. They were following orders. They couldn't have stopped it. They didn't know. Lies. But lies that reveal something important. They never built accountability into their system. They never created mechanisms for soldiers soldiers to refuse immoral orders. They never established that some things were unacceptable no matter who ordered them. The American military system, flawed, imperfect, inconsistent, was different. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. American forces committed other atrocities that were never prosecuted. Racial discrimination was built into the military structure. Japanese American citizens were imprisoned, while German Americans largely weren't. Double standards existed everywhere. But at Biscari, at least, the system worked. Investigations were ordered. Evidence was collected. Courts-martial were convened. Verdicts were rendered. Consequences were imposed. The system held itself accountable. Not perfectly. Not completely. Sergeant West's sentence was commuted. Captain Compton was acquitted. No general officers were punished, despite their role in creating the environment that led to massacre. But it was something. More than the Germans did. More than the Soviets did. More than most armies throughout history have ever done. And that something mattered. Because here's what happens when armies don't have accountability. Abu Ghraib, My Lai, the Highway of Death, Haditha, Mahmudiyah. Countless incidents across countless wars where soldiers committed atrocities and faced no consequences. Where commanders looked the other way. Where institutional pressure favored covering up rather than investigating. Every time an army fails to hold itself accountable, it moves closer to becoming the thing it claims to fight against. Every unpunished war crime makes the next one easier. Every covered-up massacre normalizes brutality. Discipline erodes. Standards slip. The line between soldier and killer blurs. And eventually, you end up with an army that's no longer fighting for anything except victory. An army that's abandoned the principles it was created to defend. That's the real danger. Not that soldiers might commit war crimes. That's an unfortunate reality of warfare. But that institutions might stop caring when they do. Biscari mattered because Patton insisted on caring. He could have buried it, should have buried it, by the logic of career preservation. His superiors would have preferred it. The press would never have known. The public would never have cared about dead SS soldiers anyway. But he didn't bury it. He dragged it into the light. Ordered investigations, supported courts-martial, let his own rhetoric be examined and questioned, accepted responsibility, at least privately. And in doing so, he sent a message that rippled through the American military. There are lines that cannot be crossed. Not for tactical advantage. Not for revenge. Not because the enemy is monstrous. Never. Today, the U.S. military teaches Biscari at service academies and officer training courses. Not as a proud moment, but as a cautionary tale. As a reminder that leadership has consequences. That words matter. That discipline is what separates professional soldiers from armed mobs. The lesson isn't that American forces are incapable of atrocity. The lesson is that they're entirely capable of it, and that only constant vigilance, clear guidance, and institutional accountability prevent it. Every commander who studies Biscari learns something George S. Patton learned too late. That inspiring aggression is easy. Maintaining discipline is hard. That soldiers will interpret ambiguous guidance in the worst possible ways. That what you say in the heat of the moment can lead to death years later, continents away, in ways you never intended. That taking responsibility is harder than assigning blame. That admitting mistakes is more important than maintaining image. That how you respond to failure defines you more than any victory. George S. Patton died in December 1945, 60 years old, far from home. His legacy is complicated. Brilliant tactician, effective commander, deeply flawed human being, vain, profane, sometimes cruel, a man of his time, with all the prejudices and limitations that implies, but also a leader willing to learn, to change, to admit mistakes, to enforce standards even when it damaged his reputation. Biscari was his greatest failure, but how he responded to it, with honesty, accountability, and determination to do better, was one of his finest moments. The 80 men who died in the ditches outside Biscari Airfield are forgotten by history. No monuments remember them. No ceremonies honor them. They were enemy soldiers, some SS, some Wehrmacht, who surrendered and were murdered. Their deaths should have meant nothing. In the vast catastrophe of World War II, 80 executed prisoners barely registers. Millions died. Whole cities were destroyed. Civilizations were extinguished. What's 80 more bodies? But those 80 bodies meant something. They meant that even in a just war there are unjust acts. They meant that even when fighting monsters, you can become monstrous. They meant that victory without honor is no victory at all. They meant that the line between civilization and barbarism is thin, fragile, and must be defended constantly. They meant that accountability, difficult, uncomfortable, politically dangerous accountability, is what separates nations worth defending from tyrannies that deserve destruction. There's a temptation, when studying history, to divide it into simple categories: good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains, the righteous and the wicked. But reality is more complicated. The Allies were the good guys in World War II. The Nazis were evil. That's not moral relativism. That's factual truth. The Holocaust, the genocides, the wars of aggression, these were genuine evils that needed to be stopped. But being on the right side doesn't make you incapable of wrong acts. Fighting for justice doesn't automatically make all your actions just. Defeating evil doesn't mean you're purely good. The Allies won World War II. That was necessary, right, and good. But they also committed crimes, made mistakes, did things that violated their own stated principles. And how they responded to those failures, whether with cover-ups or investigations, denial or accountability, determined what kind of nations they would become after the war ended. Biscari was a test, and imperfectly, inconsistently, inadequately, the American military passed it. Not with perfect justice, not with complete accountability, not with the kind of moral clarity that makes for satisfying stories, but they tried, they investigated, they prosecuted, they imposed consequences. And George S. Patton, the general who'd inspired the massacre with careless words, insisted on accountability even when it threatened his career. That's the legacy. Not that Americans never committed atrocities, but that when they did, someone cared enough to respond, to investigate, to prosecute, to say, this was wrong. This violated our principles. This cannot stand. The line between soldier and killer, between warrior and war criminal, between justified force and murder. That line is real. It matters. And it must be defended. Not because defenders are morally superior human beings, but because without that line, war becomes genocide. Combat becomes massacre. Liberation becomes conquest. George S. Patton spent his career pushing men to be more aggressive, more violent, more willing to close with and destroy the enemy. And at Biscari, he learned that aggression without discipline leads to atrocity. That violence without restraint becomes murder. That victory without honor is meaningless. He learned it too late for 80 men. But he learned it and spent the rest of his life, however short it was, trying to ensure no one else made the same mistake. The war ended. The bodies were buried. The ditches filled in. But the lesson remains. Some lines cannot be crossed. Not for victory, not for revenge, not for anything. Because once you cross them, once you decide that rules don't apply to you, that some people are outside the protection of law, you've become the thing you claim to fight against. You've lost what made you worth defending in the first place. You've abandoned the principles that give your cause meaning. George S. Patton understood that in the end. It cost him, but he understood. And that understanding, hard-won, blood-bought, carved from failure, is the real story of what Patton did when he found out his soldiers executed 50 SS guards. He didn't hide it, he didn't excuse it, he didn't justify it, he faced it, investigated it, prosecuted it, learned from it, and carried that lesson until the day he died. That's leadership. That's accountability. That's what separates soldiers from killers, armies from mobs, nations from tyrannies, and civilization from chaos.